And now I want to introduce Jim Tallon, and he's going to be talking about what the Regent's priorities for funding education are this year.
Jim, I ran off of this.
I'm not using it. Susan, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I actually didn't answer the second part of your first question, why is it important? I said we're doing a $20 billion spend on this every year, so that just de facto makes it important. But it is obviously important because of the social implications. And I think as I start to talk about what some of the Regents' priorities are, among my colleagues on the Board of Regents, there is a deep-seated concern at this point about the interaction of concentrations of poverty and failures in local economies, where people are seeing pockets of deprivation in parts of the state that they are finding different than what they had experienced previously. And this sets the whole aspiration up about what is possible to be done. And I think that when you come down to it, this is not only a huge fiscal question and not only an important governmental question, but obviously it is a societal question that is coming to focus in this conversation. I did not use a PowerPoint because I really want to give you some impressions of the work that the board is doing. The Regents, I've chaired the State Aid Committee now since 2003. As I said, I succeeded Carl in 2002, got the state aid assignment. What that has actually earned me over the years is the opportunity to be deposed as a witness. With respect to any plaintiffs in the room, I don't know if any plaintiffs are in the room, but to be deposed on every year's proposal that we've done, and be reminding, did you really say that? Yeah, we did in fact say that. We, with others in the room, advanced the foundation concept in 2004. And one of the things that hasn't come up, you know, there's a dilemma here. We're looking at the entirety of the foundation aid formula. We're looking also, in any given year, we're looking at the increment as it relates to that year's budget. And some of that is achieved through phase-in, but some of it is achieved in getting to the necessary compromises that are necessary to pass a budget. For example, when the recession, the deep recession hit, we actually pulled back almost $1 billion on our state aid proposal. So we live in the reality of trying to make an estimate that is consistent with good educational policy, that's consistent with good fiscal policy, but also stays at the forward edge of advocating for educational financing, but recognizing the give and take of state politics and what is necessary to get the legislation passed that finally does the budget. We, as I said, with others, advanced that foundation aid formula in 2004. It took until 2007. It was consistent, obviously, with the CFE court decisions. It took until 2007 to get to the point where the legislature was ready to adopt the legislation, and now we look back at 10 years. The initial phase-in was a 4-year phase-in. There have been adjustments, as you know, built into the formula that stretched out that phase-in initially to 7 years and then additionally to 7 years. And by rough estimates, we're still $3.6 to $3.8 billion short of what the phase-in would have been, with a few adjustments, of what that initial commitment was in 2007. At the time, and I'm recalling back to this time, recognized that what the foundation formula did was it consolidated some 37, 33, 34 in the mid-30s categorical programs that had previously focused some on unrestricted aid, flex aid. There had been a low English proficiency aid formula that was built in. There was an aid formula built in on extraordinary needs, or the formula. There were categorical programs that had sorted sent dollars to these various areas. And therefore, it was consistent that the foundation formula brought together all of that activity under a consolidated formula. And if you go back to it, those who were here, one of the things, and it's the oddity in all of our conversation today about complexity, because the selling point of the formula was its simplicity. How many people think it's still simple? And I, for a long time, managed to get a lot of mileage out of my argument about 4 moving parts in the formula. And the concept is still essentially there, to get a basic foundation amount, to adjust it by a student need measure, to adjust it by a regional cost measure, a recommendation, the only recommendation adopted from the Salerno Commission, 1988. I was a member. And then to estimate a local contribution that would be necessary to get the net amount of school aid that was in the district, that should go to the district. We therefore sold that simplicity idea, and I think that probably that, and important now to be thinking with the public, that notion of a foundation or a formula that people can capture and understand what we're doing is a goal that we really ought to be seeking. In other words, it's very important not to get buried by our own complexity as we're dealing with this, because winning the public argument, and I don't know whether at the 10-year point we're ready to take that next step forward, but the complexity of the argument itself, to some extent, raises a barrier, as do some of the other more controversial issues being battled out in educational space at this point. But we adopted the legislature adopted the formula in 2007, and we managed for the better part of the first year and then into the second year to do this. But all of you will recall September of 2008 when we had the meltdown of financial markets. That wasn't felt initially as much as it might have been in the spring of 2009, because there was a flow of federal money that came in to backfill what the states were losing on the revenue side. But finally, we started to feel this, and all of that was finally put into legislation in the form of the gap elimination adjustment. As I often said in our comments with the committee, we had a formula that giveth and a gap elimination adjustment that taketh away. And the one thing that did, that absolutely froze the ability of anybody to have a conversation about school aid. Because one of the things I simply found, and I'm sure that there are teachers of mathematics who understand this as they stand in the classroom, but trying to get people to analyze the slope of positive numbers versus the slope of negative numbers as we distribute across need is something that's impossible for the human mind to comprehend, at least any human mind that I've been working with on this subject. So we went silent in any meaningful conversation in the years of the gap elimination adjustment. And the Regents last year faced a choice, obviously endorsing the full elimination, the investment of the $434 million that we put into elimination of the gap elimination adjustment was an investment that did not have the most desirable distribution among districts from the priority that the Regents had usually put into its various proposals. But we went ahead and did that in order to advance, and I think a number of people came along and endorsed that with us to get to the point where we're able to have this conversation today. Now, last year, we combined and recognized, as we're thinking going forward, we combined a proposal to increase foundation aid last year by $1.3 billion. The legislature didn't go that high, but we made that recommendation. We did the recommendation for the 400 some odd cut in the gap elimination adjustment, the payback and the gap elimination adjustment, and then we did the $404 million expense aid payment that traditionally comes in as part of every annual cycle. We also raised a series of what we call potential investments. adjacent to the formula. They could be funded through the formula, but ultimately envisioned, at least in their getting a shoe in the door, as categorical investments. One of the priorities that the Regents have been focusing on in recent years has been the importance of extending our vision into the P portion of P12, and to get into universal pre-kindergarten, to get even into considerations of earlier childhood work, perhaps with our colleagues in the health field, because of the importance of early preparation for students. We've also had a priority in recent years, and I noted the growth. I actually hadn't put the number in my head recently. The growth in the percentage of English language learners in the system in recent years, and that has come to be a really important focus in the priority that the Regents have put forward. We've talked about career and technical education. We've talked about the importance of family and community engagement. We've talked about advancing in our accountability measures the concepts of struggling schools and working with the executive, working with the legislature in that subject. Let me take you inside some of the deliberations of our State Aid Committee at this point. We met just yesterday. We are in the middle of a cycle that we do every fall, in which we start in September and then move into October, November, December, in which we try to do a background piece in September, and then we try in October to start to focus in on some of the challenges that we'd face, and that's what we did at a meeting yesterday. We will present a conceptual proposal for the 17-18 school year, and recognize we're doing two things here. We're looking at the increment and the way the discussion ought to be framed for 17-18, and then we're looking at what the implications ought to be that are in, is this the opportunity to take a broader view of foundation aid going forward, set a new target, set new terms that are going to be consistent, and we will try to do both. I think what I would share with you, just some of the concerns that came up from my colleagues around the table, because as many of you know, this is now a very participatory Board of Regents, and you know, there clearly have been changes in the direction, the membership of the Board of Regents, and we're learning to work with each other. One of the concerns, and I think this is a critical challenge, we can't take for granted the assumption of an unrestricted general aid flow and foundation aid. I am a strong supporter of it. I believe that the majority of members of the Board of Regents are broad supporters of it, but there is an underlying concern, and it came up yesterday in a discussion about English language learners and the degree to which they are weighted within the student need portion of the formula. And then the question is there an accountability for that expenditure built into the obligations of local school districts? We have heard also around the argument, for example, of community schools, and as was mentioned, one of the issues that has gotten a great deal of attention is the importance of bringing, particularly dealing with disadvantaged youngsters, bringing in the supports through a community schools process, and an attitude from some of the members of the board who are close to local negotiations on these matters that indicates that you simply won't get to community schools funding if we continue to send an unrestricted amount of aid to the districts. Now, I would say to everybody here, do I add any insight to this? This is a hidden issue that is going to come up. I believe that we will prevail and that we will have a recommendation to maintain foundation aid. It certainly is what I intend to do in terms of leading this effort, and there's a majority in support of this. But I would also say at this point that there are those who are now picking aside this question of unrestricted aid going to districts, and if there's a place of working with the districts to work in terms of achieving measures of accountability, that's going to be very important going forward. Secondly, there is a growing concern with the word used earlier was density or concentrations of poverty. And as I indicated, this is coming through as people are linking up the challenges that are facing our schools and the student needs with the opportunities that they face in their communities and all of the social challenges that they face in their neighborhoods. And while we have not done this yet, this may be an area, as we're measuring and looking at student need, where we want to give some special attention to the concentrations. And that clearly also applies to those communities where the community school movement is going to have to grow beyond the relatively modest funding that's out there right now. Finally, and the report that we have before us today indicated that it took on this question of save harmless. And one of the questions that is going to come up is how do we deal with the save harmless feature for districts that have been losing population. And I think the general sentiment in the room was a sentiment that has existed right from the beginning of foundation aid back in the 2007 decisions, was to maintain a commitment to save harmless, and that clearly not yet made as a final decision. But the notion that students, the districts still face significant expense, and with the introduction of the local tax cap now, if we are really going to be limiting local revenues, then the question is, if we assume that our districts, all of our districts, need some additional revenue to be able to operate, that there's going to have to be some acknowledgement of at least not diminishing state support, if not going back to an argument about building on state support. So those are some of the impressions from inside the conversation. This is in no sense a complete analysis of where the choices are going to be with foundation aid, but if you will recognize that sort of is where our process is at this point, as we are a couple of months into this, and in November and December we'll be going further. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Great insights from Regent Tallon.